effect of absorbing magical energy. The girl said that energy vampirism was a martial art created by nightmares, but she thought it would suit him very well. The girl believed that there was no nightmare who could become a master of this art. Randy began to wonder if he had achieved greatness in the martial arts, but using magic was a much more effective way than studying martial arts. Randy threw all the bars on the ground and said he'd been collecting them for over 10,000 years. He couldn't wait for them to make him things out of those ingots. Lava's kitten of magma excitedly asking what kind of armor he wished for, he would be honored to do so. Kitten says he can create an epic sword and shield with that many materials. He offered to create an indestructible shield of adamantium and the strongest sword of orichalcum. But Randy said that's not what he wanted. He wanted kitchenware. He wanted an adamantium skillet and cutting board, and a walnut knife and utensils. Lava's kitten thought he was joking at first and asked him to answer seriously because this is serious business. But Randy said he was dead serious. From the moment he got his first adamantium nugget in the abyss, his dream had changed. He wanted the best kitchen utensils with which to prepare any ingredient in the abyss. Lava's kitten just had nothing to say to him. He was completely shocked by his words. The protagonist noticed his reaction and said it felt like he was forcing him to do something terrible. But a promise is a promise, so the cat from Lava fulfills his request by putting his whole soul into it. The girl said it was time for her to answer Randy's questions. After all, he said he wanted to know what the awakening was. Randy said it's true that he's still an incomplete constellation. He's just starting to act the constellation way. When he defeated the Varagoth and reached a degree of mastery, he saw a message from the world that said his world resonance was growing stronger. The world is eager to hear his cry. And Varagoth, in his final moment, said, "Become a constellation, not an avatar." But the guy kept thinking that he's still a man with powerful martial arts, and he needs to take one more step to become a constellation. But the girl simply replied that she'd already told him everything and that he was a constellation. She explained to him that there's no such thing as an incomplete constellation. A constellation is a constellation is a constellation is that simple. But Randy still asked further. He wondered what awakening was. After all, she had said he still had to awaken. The girl replied that she meant that he still hadn't realized he was a constellation. Even at the moment, he thought he was incomplete. Though the girl realized that he was a very special being, even among the constellations. Randy started to complain. After all, she called him special, but he didn't even know how to use magic. The girl touched his nose and said that mortals very rarely become constellations. The girl began to tell her story that she had just been born into a constellation. The girl said her power of dream existence and desire was unleashed by the nightmares. It all came together when they created me. This is the true form of the mistress of dreams and desire. Most of the other constellations are the same. Lord of blood and battle is the kitten of lava and magma. They are the constellations of his very birth. For a creature to think being a constellation is natural, but the girl explained that the guy was already a constellation. The girl told him to accept that he was a constellation. Then Randy just accepted the fact that he was a constellation. He immediately felt a great surge of power. He obtained a skill called world resonance. As a constellation invincible master trainer, Randy could use the power of the constellation. The main character completely changed his hair color and length. This all happened because of a great surge of energy. Other constellations began to notice that a new constellation was opening its eyes to the depths of the abyss. The protagonist felt very good, for he could give a great blessing, and even a message is sent. The girl said he better not go to the other avatars because they have their own constellations and he could get in trouble, so Randy had to be careful. The protagonist grabbed his head and said that from now on, if he wanted to do anything, he would have to think twice, because the avatar was the most important factor for the existence of the constellation. Because any exposure to other people's avatars could be seen as provocative. Randy could get an answer to any question just by thinking about it. The guy was remembering the past, and he couldn't understand how he didn't realize he was already a constellation, because he kept darting from side to side, trying to become the strongest. Though lost and wandering the abyss, he took it as training from the goddess. Randy even thought that the magic storm was a convenient way to move, as well as a training tool. After he remembered his mistakes, he was upset because he really thought he was training and it was all for nothing. He thought it was all training from the goddess of scales. The girl told him if he had an avatar, he should try to concentrate on it. At first, Randy said he didn't have an avatar, but then he remembered his friend, Stone Snake. The girl also added that he could restore his essence power. After all, it was possible to accumulate even more essence power than the limit allowed, so you don't have to save it. So the constellation can use their avatars to explore the abyss. And you can also see through the eyes of allied avatars. In this way, you can share vision between worlds. The protagonist pointed his finger at the sleeping girl and said there was a place where he couldn't use it all. The girl said he was talking about imprisoned nightmares. She could hide certain plots if she didn't want them to be seen. Constellation said to greet Randy. She sent an Aruni to him. It's because of the best control I have over myself. After all, it's hard to control your urges with a nightmare. The protagonist remembered the incidents that had happened to him and immediately realized what she was talking about. The girl asked if he had any other questions. Randy said no and thanked her for her explanation. The girl said she was pleased to meet a constellation expressing gratitude. Randy had only recently become a constellation, and the girl advised him that he should rarely encounter other constellations. After all, in a fight between constellations, the one with the most avatars and the most powerful essence has the advantage. But the place Randy arrived at after much training, it's the beginning of the world. It's a poverty of constellations. The main character asked her if she'd ever heard of planet Earth. The girl replied that she had heard that many strong tidings await the opening of the gate there, because of the fact that there are many souls there, which is rare in the abyss. Randy said he was from this land. The girl told him that the gate between the abyss and the earth was already open. Everything should be a mess, but luckily it's not that bad. But thanks to your explanation of the girl, Randy finally understood. The constellation that came to Earth only looked at each other, but did not collide, because they will only be weakened if they fight amongst themselves. Some devious constellation could just take control of the souls and defeat the constellations that are doing the fighting. And so, instead of just fighting, they decided to increase the number of their followers, Randy pondered. The girl thought he was very lucky. After all, there must have been relatively good constellations nearby when the gate opened, because the evil and cruel constellations will not come to a common agreement and will simply try to seize power by force. Because all constellations behave the way they do, they have nothing to lose. The girl was sure that Randy was nervous because he had left his home planet to some unknown constellations. It would also be nice to have in their alliance a constellation whose followers were the souls of Earth. Then Randy flew up in the air and cut his long hair, for it was very much in his way. The reason his hair is suddenly growing is because he's accepted himself as a constellation. The girl asked Randy what decision he had made. Does he really want to go back to Earth no matter what? The main character just smiled and said that long hair just gets in the way of training. The girl wanted to give the guy some advice since he was planning to return to his native land. If, as the girl had said, the gate to Earth was open and the nearest constellation was watching them, Randy didn't think it was necessary to openly show that he was a constellation, because even the good constellations will turn hostile against him. If it's a constellation that can fight for the land, they're much stronger than he is. And no matter how good the constellation is, they won't turn a blind eye to the fact that they might lose the soul they owned. Randy asked the girl if she wanted him to hide that he was a constellation. The girl answered that it would be much better and safer for him, and that he didn't have to use the power of his essence. The constellation would not let him out of their sight if they knew that the constellation had returned to Earth. She advised him to blend in with the common people of the land, and afterward quietly and carefully gain followers of his own. And they will become souls that embrace its essence, for this is the constellation on Earth. The protagonist asked the girl if there was a constellation on Earth that knew about him. The girl grabbed her chin and said that it was possible. It would be good to join our alliance. After all, it would increase the strength of their alliance. Randy tried to tell the story of how he fell into the abyss after meeting the goddess of scales. The girl replied that it was a very strange story, but she had heard about this constellation. The guy said that even without being able to see the future, it's not that common. Even though it doesn't seem like it, but she might have had a good plan after all. The girl replied that she had heard that she was a constellation who constantly made a fool of herself by misunderstanding her prophecies. Well, it seems like it's almost impossible to predict the future very accurately. What's the point of prophecies if she can't capitalize on them? The girl didn't realize if the goddess of scales would help their alliance. Randy said that given the way she tried to stop the evil constellations, she's probably cooperating with other constellations. The girl and Lava's kitten were very hesitant to take her into their alliance, for she was very foolish. But they decided to accept her. They asked Randy to ask her to join his alliance since he was returning to Earth. Randy was sure she would help them, although he was worried about how she would feel about him becoming a constellation. Randy thought about how to find a way to contact her. He asked his alliance friends if they knew how he could contact her, but they didn't know a thing. They did not understand how they could know where such a constellation was. Randy awakened as a constellation and joined the alliance. However, he didn't get any closer to returning to Earth at all. The protagonist felt that he personally had to find her. After all, the goddess of scales was a key figure, because the more beings that knew of her, the closer he was to Earth. Randy became very worried about whether he would be able to return to Earth in time, for his land was in danger. The protagonist turned to the servant who was escorting him around the palace. She asked him where he wanted to go, as there were plenty of beautiful places in the area. Randy said that he already had a place in mind. He had heard from his master about the Fountain of Enlightenment. The girl was surprised that he wanted to go to that place. It was a place for their training to learn to control their desires. The protagonist smiled and said if he had to wait here, he also had to undergo the training possible only here. When they arrived at the place, the girl said she had heard that in the old days, many nightmares used this place. But ever since the nightmare constellation was born, it had been under a ban. Randy asked why that was so. The servant replied because it was incredibly dangerous here. After all, she had heard that many nightmares had gone mad during training. Randy went to the well and looked down. It was the Well of Enlightenment. Randy knew that the point of training was to drink water from the well. However, if that were indeed the case, it would not have been sealed and banned. Because the stronger the desire of the person pulling the water, the heavier the water becomes. The protagonist started pulling water from the well and noticed that this water is quite heavy. He wanted to meditate and get rid of his desires, but the water will not become less. When Randy started pulling water out of the well started telling him his wish. It said if he let go of the water, he would come back to Earth. Randy's ex-girlfriend comes over and touches him. She said when they broke up it wasn't on a good note, but Randy realizes it's all manipulation and it's not really happening. While Lava's girlfriend and Kat were discussing his training, they thought, even if he is a master of training, it won't be easy for him. After all, this well is arousing and increases desire, and the bucket becomes many times heavier. Lava's kitten was worried about whether the training master would be okay, but the girl wasn't worried in the slightest. The sight of the constellation was on a completely different level than nightmares. At least she wouldn't go crazy. The girl wondered what illusions tormented him. She thought it was something incredible. Randy was on the verge of letting go of the bucket. The rope was very tight and could break at any moment. But Reddy kept training because by using the weight of his own desires, he's getting rid of them. He's addicted to training. No wonder he became a constellation. The girl and Lava's kitten looked at it and thought it was too much. Then they realized that the essence of the training is that he must pull out a bucket of water as heavy as his desire. For he who wants to pull the bucket out of the well sees the illusion corresponding to his desire, and the water becomes heavier and heavier. The servant was very worried about Randy. After all, she knew that a lot of nightmares had gone crazy trying to complete this workout. She asked Randy if he had a problem, but the protagonist nonchalantly replied that he was fine. He just found a good exercise machine for the first time in a long time. He realized that most couldn't even lift a bucket. After all, they had very little temptation. Randy told himself that he would 100% resist because he had a consciousness and he would not give in to any temptation. Randy spent most of the day exercising with the Well of Enlightenment. He told himself he could do lightweight cardio if he cleared his heart, and strength training if he let his will be willing. And the rest of the time he rested and worked on tactics, sparring with Aruni. Constellation Desire told Randy that she thought it would be much harder and longer for him, but apparently he was having a good time. Randy replied, not that he had any reason to give up practicing. When he first had free time, he started practicing right away. Hardly something because of his rush. The girl said he's a human army and a battle constellation, but Randy may have the potential to be so much more. He may have the potential of nurturing avatars and founding his kingdom. Lava Kitten finished making cutlery for Randy. It was orichalcum cutlery. When the protagonist picked it up, he was very happy about it. He told himself that with it he could cook any ingredient. Plus, he could use the knife as a sharp blade in battle. He swung the knife and spat out a lot of energy, which was a very unpleasant sound. The wishing constellation was against this kind of fun, because this knife was sharpened by a constellation blacksmith. If Randy didn't handle it carefully, it would blow the whole place apart. After the walnut cutlery, it was the turn of the adamantium utensils. The girl and Lava Cat put on their goggles to watch Randy shoot the cutlery and test its strength. He gathered some energy in his fist and was ready to fire. The force of the blow was not weak. It was amazing, because after such a powerful attack, they didn't have a scratch on them. Lava's kitten boasted that this utensil is much stronger than magical armor. Randy's little break in the nightmare world was over. Even though he was human when he entered here, he was leaving being constellations. Randy was about to leave, all the servants asking him to visit them more often. Everybody cried after them, for Randy was very kind and everybody liked his delicious food. They called him Master Gookbab. But what about Randy's invincible training master? The nightmares nicknamed him Master Gookbab. It was all because he made some food with some new items. The dish was called Hydra Meat Gookbab. All eyed this dish with caution, for they had heard that Hydra meat was quite poisonous. Randy told Arnie's servant to call her friends. After all, he had plenty of meat, so he made for everyone. The Wish constellation convinced her avatar Aruni that she didn't have to try it if she didn't want to. After all, Hydra meat contains deadly poison, and there's no need to put herself in that kind of danger. But Aruni ate it all with gusto. She said it was very warming, and she could feel her stats rising. The other nightmares were also asking for food. They were eager to taste the dish, and there were quite a few of them. After all, the nightmare's obsession with the Gookbap had caused quite a fuss. The situation was resolved only after the intervention of the hostess. The protagonist thought he could practice cooking and increase the power of his essence, but he was a little uncomfortable. He ended up causing this ugly scene. Randy had reached the border of Nightmare World. Beyond was the territory ruled by the Serpent of Plague and Darkness. This territory looked terrifying. Randy thought he should use some essence power so this gloomy guy wouldn't stress him out. But he decided to hide his identity from the world. Randy thought he would be safer that way, and then he disappeared from the sight of the constellations. He noticed that the world had become very quiet and peaceful. He couldn't believe that he was being blown away by the flood of messages from the constellations because he couldn't do something simple. The Serpent-Bearer of Plague and Darkness orders all avatars to find an invincible master of training. He told his avatar when they found him not to fight him alone, because there was no way they could beat Randy. That they should never try to use force on him or they'd die. On his way, Randy met a skeleton in front of him. The skeleton said he was trespassing on his master's territory, and such insolence will not go unpunished. But his master is very generous. The skeleton told him to make Randy his master's avatar. If Randy joins him, he'll forget the disrespect and recognize Randy as a valued subordinate. But the protagonist just smiled and thought that it really does seem like a generous constellation. I guess Randy didn't realize what was happening yet. The avatar tried to skewer Mamet. The Abyss constellation were well prepared for this kind of scenario. The skeleton pointed the sword at him and said if he refused the offer, his master would come and deal with Randy. But the protagonist wasn't the least bit afraid of it. He covered his nose because the skeleton stank of rot. After that, Randy shouted that all the messengers of plague and darkness should not hide behind their avatar and show their essence. The skeleton was shocked at his behavior, for he still didn't understand the situation he was in. Randy turned to the skeleton and told him to call his master quickly, for it would be worse. But he wouldn't come out. Then Randy said he'd make him do it. Then Randy started wrecking everything around him. He said he was going to wreck everything when the constellation didn't come out. The protagonist yelled that he'd be considered a coward if he didn't come out. After all, he can't even defend his territory. The meaning of such statements was perfectly understandable. Then Randy got the skill Good and Giant Fighter. In case of victory, his essence power would be enhanced. Then the Nightmare Mistress contacted him and told him it was crazy to fight against the constellation. That's when Randy realized they could be watching him because he'd forgotten all about it. The Mistress of Nightmares said it was reckless to challenge a constellation to a fight. Randy got the base level of Space Tunguska. It was added by the Divine Space Art. Original motive at the Master of Training, even after Randy fell into the Abyss, he was never a force to be reckoned with. Being a weak person, he had always struggled with hostility. From the point of view of a powerless man, he did the best he could. But after he became a constellation, Randy changed a lot, although he didn't realize it himself. He was always hiding from the older constellations. Like the last cowards, he stayed in neutral territory, away from the prying eyes of the constellations. Randy had lost the point of fighting. He told himself he had to follow his own path, living like a constellation. The fact that Randy's opponent was a constellation didn't change anything about how he felt about him. He wasn't the least bit afraid of the other constellations. A large green smoke appeared above the protagonist. Randy immediately realized it was a constellation. This flying constellation looked pretty intimidating. It was too late to run. It was a mid-ranking constellation called the Herald of Plague and Darkness. He stood before the avatars and those doomed to die. The messenger of plague and darkness thought his opponent was crazier than he expected. After all, for some reason, the constellation is much weaker than him. The Herald of Plague and Darkness didn't understand why such a weak opponent would challenge him. He grabbed his beard and said if Randy defeats Tho, he would be completely destroyed even if he knitted himself into this battle. The Plague Herald realized if he won, he would gain nothing, but if he lost, he had a lot to lose. However, he had nowhere to go. If he didn't accept his challenge, then his reputation status would fall greatly and the other constellations would mock him. The protagonist wouldn't even talk to him and attacked him right away. Even though Randy was the first to challenge, he never let his guard down. After all, this was his first battle with a constellation. The constellation of darkness realized that the difference in the power of their existence was too great, and he must end it quickly, using his power. But it was to Randy's advantage to end this fight quickly, because if the fight drags on, Randy has very little chance of winning. Randy immediately decided to start with his strongest attack, which was called the Space Fist. The constellation of darkness felt pain for the first time, as if his essence was being torn apart. Other constellations, including the Herald of Darkness, rarely fight in person. Activating Dark Herald. He knew it was a crazy technique that Randy had used, but he didn't yet understand if it was magic or not. Randy realized his technique was working, and he didn't want to miss his chances. He started using his best to get this fight over with. The main character jumped up and hit him with a cultivation energy. The force of the blow was so great that the earth broke in half. After this attack, the protagonist realized that his opponent was being weak, so that he could suddenly attack and strike a victorious blow. The servants of the constellation of darkness watched this fight, and were all amazed by the fight between the two constellations. They realized that they were far from this level. The services of darkness didn't understand how a pathetic constellation like Randy could stand up to their unimitated master messenger of plague and darkness. The guy realized that the fight was just beginning and it would be very, very difficult for him because he knew who his opponent was. Suddenly, the constellation of darkness started begging Randy not to hurt him because he was giving up. But the main character said he couldn't fool him with that trick. So he punched him in the face. But Constellation of Darkness begged him to stop beating him. He promised to give him his territory and his avatars. The girl and the lava kitten were simply amazed. They did not expect such a turn of events, because it was a great shame for the constellation to admit their defeat, especially to give up their territories and the avatar. Lava's kitten told Randy that the constellation was actually surrendering, a view the constellation could never take away about the oath of its life. But Randy didn't understand what he meant, why the constellation would give up. The kitten says if a constellation is badly hurt, it may give up. The protagonist smiled. He didn't expect the victory to be so easy. After the victory, Randy improved his skills tremendously. His body began to glow with yellow flames. He felt much stronger than he was. Randy then held his hand out straight and said that his martial arts were in good condition, for they worked even on constellations. Randy felt a strange sensation. He began to feel rivers of pus and buildings from the rotten river of tumors. Randy began to feel each avatar, for these were his new avatars and his new kingdom. But when Randy looked at them, he almost threw up. Then he turned to the messenger of darkness and told him he was giving his kingdom back. Randy said he didn't want his kingdom back. Looking at Randy walking away, the messenger of plague and darkness was confused. Because battles between constellations are dangerous, both sides risk the wind. The winner takes everything from the loser. That's what happens to prevent a future threat from the loser. The complete erasure of the loser's existence is common for constellations. The constellation of darkness realized that this guy had spared him and left him a kingdom with avatars. He was glad, but that sense of loss was drowning him out. Kitty told Randy he'd never seen anyone take on a constellation as an avatar. He thought leaving the kingdom and the avatars was a mistake. Well, Randy said he didn't care because he wouldn't be able to control them. Randy believed that this technique he had invented in the battle with Aruni was his greatest acquisition. To get so close to an opponent that he couldn't use magic, not give him a chance to use the power of the essence, and then slay him. The protagonist thought he could fight. Even if he met a constellation much stronger than him, he would be able to resist it. Then Randy went to the other constellations. They told him that they had seen him defeat the messenger of plague and darkness in the constellation, and they were quite amazed. One of the constellations told him he didn't think he'd show up here. But he didn't seem to have any sense of fear at all. One of the constellations said he couldn't be defeated as easily as that rotten weakling. After all, he had to prepare to face the full force of his kingdom. This was the mid-level constellation of the one who turns back time. That's what Randy was hoping for. He was ready to take them all down with his power. When they heard rumors of what happened to the messenger of plague and darkness, they prepared for all sorts of scenarios. In other words, Randy now had to fight all the avatars of the kingdom. It took him years by the standards of the abyss before he faced the constellation. Well, Randy won after all. Then he met a mid-level constellation with a voice from the depths of the sea. This constellation said that she had heard a lot about him, that he had defeated many enemies, but the constellation said that it would be quite difficult to defeat him. There would be no point in their battle, so the shark constellation suggested a compromise. Well, Randy said he didn't agree, so he attacked them from behind, taking them by surprise. After years of fighting, Randy emerged victorious. Randy's rival was a mid-level constellation called the Truth Preacher. Truth Preacher had heard of him. He knew he was called the Invincible Master of Training. But this constellation was distracted by a lava kitten, at which point Randy could get up unnoticed and attack it. Thanks to the kitten, the fight lasted only hours. It was considered one of the fastest fights between the constellations. One day the main character was cooking a meal and thought he still hadn't found a way back to Earth. But he didn't seem to be in any hurry to do so. After all, it had been a long time since he had been on his territory. If Randy met a story, he would fight it, and if he met a monster, he would eat it and make a nice meal. He was always fighting and cooking. Friend, in the usual moment when Randy was just having lunch, a blue gate appeared in front of him. These gates randomly appearing in the abyss. Randy thought it would be a good way to meet new opponents. Randy didn't know what was beyond this gate, but decided to take a chance. He hoped that beyond this gate was the planet Earth. It's like the lottery, he told himself. When Randy walked through the gate, he saw before him an ordinary forest with mountains. He couldn't believe his eyes if this was the planet Earth. He thought he'd won the lottery. The lava kitten would be interested to know who brought him here. But first, Randy wanted to find people to make sure this planet was Earth. Well, when Randy entered this village, he saw goblins in front of him. The protagonist thought at first that it had been a long time, and the humans had disappeared and the goblins had appeared. Then Kitten told him that even though it looked like Earth, it wasn't. It was a goblin planet, otherwise known as Goblin Heaven. Although Randy had seen goblins in the dungeons from time to time, he thought they were just monsters. Contrary to his expectations, they could create a real village. Even though the Goblin Kingdom looked like Earth, the planet was much closer to planet Earth. That means that portals appear much more often here. The goblins of the Hilt, compared to humans, had been fighting monsters from the abyss for much longer. And so the monster fighting systems were much better than humans. But this system only worked when they encountered regular monsters. Suddenly, a planet-devouring white wolf appears on this planet. It was called Borealis Lupus, and it was said to be as strong as a constellation. The goblin commander immediately went to fight him. One of the goblins told him that he shouldn't go there because it's very dangerous. Well, the goblin leader said that he is the commander. If he can't fight this monster, then he won't be able to look his people in the eye. The Goblin King said he was no coward, said he would not run away, and would answer for his duty. This king's name was Odagon. He was read as the strongest wizard in the Hilt. Even if it was the end for the Hilt, he promised to at least leave a big scar on that monster so he would never forget it. Suddenly, Randy appears out of nowhere. He attacked this monster with his powerful attack. The monster screamed in pain. The protagonist expected everyone to be surprised with his appearance, but it was expected that everyone would be surprised by his power. Randy realized he only had one chance. In terms of combat power, this wolf was comparable to a mid-level constellation. Well, it wasn't a constellation, since its existence wasn't centered on any one thing. The protagonist realized that he now had a chance to stop him, so he started attacking him full force. Randy decided to use everything he had. He flew up to M height and began to release the blue energy from his body. The wolf was unable to fend off this attack and was defeated in one blow. After this victory, Randy's skills improved even more. Fortunately, everything went according to Randy's plan, and the fight didn't last long. The protagonist always felt a sense of crisis when faced with constellations or monsters comparable to them. Randy realized that these were creatures that mortals dared not confront. Kitten said that such strong creatures have little experience fighting their equals. Kitten complimented Randy on his strategy. Randy thanked him for that, however. If he had withstood his last attack a little longer, or had been prepared beforehand, this battle would have lasted several centuries. The protagonist realized there were many things he was weak at. When the protagonist landed on the ground in front of the goblins, he hoped they wouldn't attack him, especially after they saw what Randy was capable of. The Goblin King walked up to Randy and knelt before him. He said that the other constellations had never helped them, but Randy was the only one who had come here and helped his people. Then the goblin bent down even lower and said that Randy was now his god and his master. Then the other goblins bowed to him and swore allegiance to him. Randy was shocked at the behavior of the goblins. Then the power of the constellation Randy increased according to the number of souls who worshipped him. The world resonated with him. After that, his power constellation more began to awaken. He gained the skill of the constellation of the territory of belonging to the invincible god. The protagonist looked at his hands and told himself that his essence had become much stronger. Lava's kitten says that he has become much more powerful in his mind. But Randy thought about not showing his power to humans. He thought that humans were not like goblins. They would not submit. The reality is that they are constantly trying to destroy and fix others for themselves. There's been a lot of cases like this. Just before Randy was about to leave, the Goblin King ran up behind him and said he wanted to go with him. The protagonist told the goblin he was headed for the abyss, and a mortal like him would be very dangerous and difficult to follow. Well, the Goblin King said it didn't matter. He would follow him even into the darkest depths of the abyss. Then the goblin bowed to him again, and said that he was the Goblin King of the Odagon. He said that his people must repay their debt to Randy, or they would live with a great desire to do so. The protagonist sensed that this goblin had a very powerful magic power surrounding his entire body, even compared to earthly hunters. He has a very powerful force to be reckoned with. Then Randy turned his back and said that his mage abilities would be very useful to him. He let him go with him, but told him not to let the goblin regret it later. The goblin asked him what he wanted to find in the abyss. Randy said he wanted to find a planet called Earth. Then he asked the goblin if he had heard of it. Well, it was the first time the goblin had heard of such a planet. The story till today of how the man Randy became an invincible master trainer. And just like that, the Goblin King became his subordinate. On their way to the abyss, they saw a very powerful storm. Randy said they should go into the storm to get to the abyss faster, he told the goblin. Yes, he could refuse because he wasn't forcing him. Well, the Goblin King said he would go in because he considered Randy his master after he saved him. A piece of land the size of the mainland was destroyed in an instant. The goblin was very surprised, although the magic curtain was not rare in the abyss, but this particular one was very strong. The Goblin King inquired of Randy. He once with the help of a magical storm. Ren, I said, if done right, it is a very fast and good way to travel in the abyss. The Goblin King had heard that even the constellation avoided him. Well, for his master's sake, he was willing to go all the way. The Goblin King said since this size magic storm is too big, it will produce a lot of byproducts and will disappear. The protagonist interrogated, what does byproduct mean? The goblin said that many places in the abyss are actually byproducts of a magical storm, and this magical storm will leave behind a dungeon. That's where the abyss monsters come from. If you don't deal with them, they will just wipe everything off the face of the earth. Ever since the magic and monsters of the abyss penetrated the earth, people's lives have changed a lot. Core Island with magical power, an environmentally friendly way to generate energy on Earth. By connecting the Earth to the abyss, mankind has a new, environmentally friendly way of obtaining energy. And the other parts of the monsters are also very useful. Thanks to all this, the level of biology and other sciences has risen a lot. Amidst these many opportunities, Parker's Pound has grown rapidly. Pharmaceutical company Kaiser, a company specializing in artifacts, major players in the abyss industry. The Goblin and Randy continued to travel the galaxy to find Earth. The Goblin was very nauseous, for he couldn't move through space. The Goblin was very surprised that Randy was moving through space with ease, and he wasn't even getting sick. Randy said magic was a handy thing. The Goblin was very happy that his master appreciated his skills. He said if his master needed to learn magic, he would help him. But the protagonist refused. He wasn't interested in magic. He asked the Goblin to check the area he flew through. It was like watching in a game. Constellations can see through the eyes of their avatars. The Goblin hovered in the air. Raggy orders could have him check out what was in the shadows of the building in front of him. In the distance, they saw some things strewn about. When the Goblin flew closer, he saw that it was something unusual. There were some symbols written on it that Goblin didn't understand. The protagonist began to look closely. He could tell that this was used to wrap a special magical weapon. Most likely it was made by the same tribe that built this temple. When the Goblin looked at the bottom, his look changed immediately. He said that Randy was right. His prediction had come true. It was a huge horde of ghouls, a couple thousand to be exact. The Goblin said that he could kill them all if his master finished it. With the 7th Circle Effect Zone spell, he could wipe out those pathetic ghoulies and the temple in one fell swoop, turning them to ash so they can take care of the boss who's hiding somewhere. The Goblin asked to do this to prove to Randy that he was his proud avatar, but the main character told him to calm down. because if the ghouls were crowding there, it could mean that they had someone or something surrounded. Randy started running with all his might. He said he had to save those who were trapped. He had already killed more zombies with just one attack, because he had read that they were holding people and/or monsters that knew how to get to Earth. He believed that they would lead him to Earth. Then the protagonist realized what they found in the square was Earth food. When Randy was fighting the monsters, he asked the goblin to turn him into something small with magic. After all, if he presented himself like that in front of whoever was stuck there would be a lot of trouble. Because not all goblins of the abyss are adequate creatures. Most of them are very evil and bloodthirsty goblins. Hunters from the ground are used to encountering goblins in dungeons. The goblin was furious because he didn't understand how he could be considered a monster, because he was very kind. Randy sighed heavily and said that people like that, and he had to accept it. It would be better for him to reincarnate. The goblin began to transform. He could use the magic of the sixth circle polymorphism. The goblin reincarnated a very handsome man. He immediately said that among the goblins he was known for his beauty. Randy was very surprised, for he looked like a perfect man and his outfit was like a wizard's. Randy noticed that the zombies just surrounded the hunters and did nothing. He wondered what kind of boss was here. The zombies started climbing the rock. The goblin said that if they had intelligence, they wouldn't just surround this mountain. Maybe sending zombies is all he can do. Then there was a very high probability that Goulet controlled a really strong army. In the abyss, these zombies were known as the Gully Kings. They were pretty strong and scary. King Taran of the Ghouls. It's a monster made up of thousands of ghouls. Those who see only ghouls and try to find the one who controls them risk suffering a surprise attack. Then the goblin in a human body made a verdict that they are not very dangerous, because for the majority of them do not pose any particular danger, but those whose skills are above average are crushed by quantity. There was a group of hunters in captivity. They were very careful about their food because they realized that they were here for a long time. They did not hope that someone would rescue them. It was their first day of captivity. The first day they lost some of their provisions. But they found a shelter underground where they could hide from the ghouls. Then they managed to close the door, but they couldn't get out because they were surrounded by thousands of zombies. One of the zombies almost got to them, but he was swatted by the stone door. Then one of the hunters used the flame of the arrow to finish him off. The commander was banging his head against a rock and crying. He realized that he had let his team down. But there was no other way out. His team had spent a whole month without being able to do anything. Randy shows up and kicks down the stone door with his strength. It was quite a surprise, for they had no hope of escape. The main character immediately asked them, "Is there anyone here from planet Earth?" The captain was in shock. He thought they were just going to die. He didn't expect anyone to save them. The other hunters began to rejoice very much. My eyes were tears of happiness. They thought it was the rescue party that had come for them. One of the hunters said his crew were idiots and they should get ready to fight. This hunter's name was Gan. He read that these are not liberators, but they're enemies who want to kill them. He pointed his finger at them and said that the restrictions on entering the dungeon would only allow one person in. How could there be two? Randy held his head up and said he didn't realize there was a one-person limit. He apologized for the misunderstanding. The protagonist said he didn't come here through the dungeon entrance. Then Gan asked him how he had gotten here. Randy said that they had come here through the abyss. They had a long way to go, and the hunters' faces showed how surprised they were. Randy made up a story that they were missing in the abyss. After the gate was opened, accidents were common. Many were drawn to the gate or the dungeon where they disappeared. Most didn't come back, but there were some lucky ones who did. But Hunter Gan didn't continue to believe them. He asked them how they could prove it. How could they prove that they were not monsters, but real people? Randy said it doesn't matter if they believe him or not. Even if they didn't believe him, they had no choice. After all, they were two energetic individuals of unknown strength who could have come here from the abyss. And exhausted, conflict-torn hunters who had been starving for a long time. Simple hunters below B rank. Then the hunters agreed with him. Even if they don't believe in such a situation, they have no other choice. The protagonist said you shouldn't be so suspicious of your saviors. Anyway, you're all from planet Earth. The commander asked what happened to the zombies that surrounded them. Randy coldly replied that they were all dead. The captain wondered very much how one man could have handled them. Then Randy pointed his finger at the goblin who had transformed into a man. Randy said he was a great wizard. The protagonist remembered the plan to return to Earth, which he shared with his Alliance allies. He recalled that they told him to keep the attention of the Earth constellations low, to discreetly expand the number of his supporters. Instead of attracting undue attention, he was going to cautiously scout the current situation on Earth. Hunter Gunn asked if he was also the missing man from the Abyss. Randy answered that yes, he had an even more tragic story than he did, because he had lost his memory. People started to feel sorry for him. The goblin could barely contain himself not to sneer at them. He thought to himself that these lowlifes still felt sorry for him. Hunter Gang asked Randy. It turns out he was a mage, too, since they wouldn't have been able to do it alone. The main character smiled and said he wasn't a mage, he used a martial art. After saying that, Randy noticed that all the hunters were stunned by his answer. After all, it was impossible for them to reach such a level with just martial arts. Gan couldn't believe his words. After all, he uses martial arts. This was the first time Gan had seen such a thing. He wondered how long he had been in the Abyss. The main character asked them why they were looking at him so strangely. Gan replied that they were very surprised, and that they hadn't seen a martial artist in a very long time. You're 90% more into magic now. Randy began to tell them that when he was in the Abyss, martial artists were not honored at all. Randy asked what year it was. They told him it was 2039. Then they realized that he had been in the Abyss for years. Everyone looked at him like he was crazy. The record was years old, but this man is now in a mental institution. So Randy set a new record in the Abyss. After that, Randy showed his fighting skills. He tossed a huge rock and smashed it into small pieces with a single kick of his foot. Everyone's mouths were open in amazement because it was the first time they'd ever seen one. Randy thought that apparently they really don't have martial artists there. He was frustrated that nothing had changed over the years. They started to go outside because the dungeon was set up so that zombies were only regular monsters, but also a crowd forming a boss. They wanted to take out all the monsters to clear the dungeon, so they had only one choice to break free. They had to finish off the rest of them. One of the hunters asked the goblin in a human body. He was thought to be a rank hunter who rebelled against Richard. They thought he had lost his memory and began to feel sorry for him. The goblin thought that he would let them do what they wanted because the protagonist had asked him to behave carefully, but to him it was very disgusting. Gan told Randy that it was hard to find a strong hunter who could lead other high-ranking dungeons. Randy replied that he was aware of this and asked why they were so polite. Gan replied that they are their saviors. Since he had been in the Abyss for years, they considered Randy an old man. Randy became very uncomfortable about his age. He asked them to consider only his earthly age. Years of... The protagonist noticed that all the hunters were beginning to approach the Odaigon. He turned to the other hunters and said, "Though Odaigon is a strong mage, why don't they come near me?" Randy was indignant. Gan said it was because he was a martial artist. Randy was very upset that they disrespected a martial artist so much. Then he started talking about a martial artist. It was Master Li. But the hunters were stunned by his words. They said that the year Randy fell into the Abyss. Like Randy were hunters who chose the path of martial arts, even though martial arts were considered inferior to magic. Most of these hunters went to China instead of their greatest concentration. Even though the martial artists were weaker, with the recruitment of more disciples, the revival of the martial arts era was possible. There was also a living legend who had reached the rank. The martial arts had a bright future. At least that was what everyone thought. When there was shocking news on TV, the news was that the mastermind was involved in a rank manipulation scandal. In the year similar scandals came to light, in China, America, and elsewhere. In simple terms, hunters would bribe judges and change their rank. S-ranked became B-ranked, B-ranked became A-ranked, and made heroes of themselves. Randy's reaction showed how surprised he was. Then Mr. Li was also considered a ranking hero of China, but in fact he was a B-rank hero. After saying that, Randy's world turned upside down. After all, Master Li was just perfect for him. He even bought pictures and posters of him. The hunter took him by the shoulder and said that after this scandal, the reputation of martial artists had suffered greatly. Many have abandoned the martial arts. I mean that it's impossible to achieve a rank by this method. The captain said that no one uses martial arts now. After the incident, this tradition has disappeared. There are no more martial arts students or schools. Randy was in a panic. He didn't understand how his idol could be so eager about it. The main character tried to calm down. For the more he worried, the more his energy drained away. Sadness would only cause his muscles to atrophy. He asked the hunters if everything was all right on Earth, but the hunters didn't understand what he was asking. Randy decided to ask directly if there had been a constellation invasion of planet Earth. One of the hunters approached Randy and said he must be referring to the incident of the year. The hunter thought it was a real disaster. He asked Randy how he knew it had happened because Randy was in the Abyss. Randy was beginning to worry, for while he was lost in the Abyss, the prophecy of the goddess had come true. He hoped that he was not too late and that all was well with the Earth. The fall of that year, when a case of rank manipulation was uncovered. It wasn't business as usual that day. All the people started looking up at the sky. There was a big flash in the sky and it scared people a lot. Fire beams started shooting on the ground. It was a real disaster for the people, many people killed and injured. Then the gate was different from a normal dungeon gate, and the monsters had minds. It was a veritable army of assassins, an army that had one goal, that followed orders and acted according to strategy. Their only strategy was to take over Earth and kill more Earthlings' souls. The protagonists grabbed the hunter by the shoulders and began to shout at him strongly. He asked him what was the next thing that happened on Earth, whether the Earth was taken over by evil constellations. Hunter Gan asked him to calm down. He said they gave them a good fight. Randy couldn't believe what he heard. How could ordinary humans fight back against them? After all, constellations and avatars are very powerful. The hunter said there were a lot of human casualties, but they were able to stop them and give them a good fight back. All the countries mobilized their best hunters to stop the invasion. The guy fell to his knees from shock. He asked himself only one question, then he didn't need to do anything else. He didn't understand why he had skedaddled across the abyss. He didn't realize the goddess's prophecy wasn't wrong, or she had miscalculated. Nightmare Constellation joined this conversation. It was very strange to her, for this was not just a small skirmish, but a full-fledged constellation invasion. Even if a mortal sent their forces, would it even be realistic to stop them at all? It's not just different levels of power. Constellation and mortal are completely different. Even if there are many hunters, they are just like small insects to them. Randy agreed with the girl. It seemed very strange to him, too. He asked them how the humans had stopped the constellation. Gan replied that they hadn't exactly stopped them. It was more like a truce. They weren't sure they needed to expand the territory they were occupying, and the people suffered too many casualties if you tried to retake the lost territories. But people were very worried about the truce with these demons, and oddly enough, it's still going on. It was probably because the constellations promised to protect the Earth. The girl was sitting on the grass at the time, and she understood. She said if there were constellations here in the first place, it makes sense. Even if new constellations took over the land, they could transfer their power to the avatars and make them fight. Unlike Randy, constellations rarely fight on their own, but against Randy they'd have to go out and fight in person. That's when the protagonist realized why the truce had lasted so many years. The invasion of the constellations changed the hierarchy, and it was this that caused the Abyss to connect to Earth. To avoid a full-scale war, a compromise was reached to restore the balance of power. The truce was possible because they either didn't want to fight themselves or didn't want to lose their avatars. Then Randy said he had no business being here anyway. He said to stop the invasion of the evil constellations. He went into the Abyss, but came back too late. The protagonist felt guilty for not being able to save people. Lava Kitten said it's all wrong even though they're a couple decades late, but the situation is over. The girl also said that the truce can't last forever. There are so many other constellations in the Abyss that may still decide to invade the Earth. It meant if things got worse, the Earth would become a battlefield where the constellations would fight for dominion over the Earth. The Odagon spotted a living zombie and shot it with magic. The other hunters began to praise him, saying that his magic was truly marvelous. The hunter said he had never seen anyone use first circle magic like that. But the human goblin replied that it was only first circle magic. The hunters kept praising him more and more. It made the goblin angry because he knew it wasn't sincere. He was holding back thanks to Randy's request. The protagonist watched it from the sidelines and realized that the goblin wouldn't last long. It was obvious that they were making him very angry. Nightmare Constellation told him to be careful. The view on Earth is not enough just to hide the power of existence, because there could be a great battle between the constellations. If Randy didn't properly conceal his identity, he could provoke a great conflict. Randy was well aware of that, and said he would be very careful. The protagonist asked the hunter what they do with people who come back from the Abyss. Hunter Hans said they were getting physicals and being asked about their experiences. Most of them were just crazy. No one could take that much strain on their brains. After the invasion, a new law was passed on Earth. It was forbidden to become avatars of evil constellations. Randy understood their anger at the constellation, for they had come and destroyed their home. After the war, people had become very strict. Anyway, the procedure isn't that complicated. The hunter asked what country he was from. Randy said he was Korean. Hunter Gunn said he would have a new citizenship. Main character. He approached the Odaigon and told him that he had gotten enough information about the situation on Earth. Randy wondered what the skill level of the hunters was. Then the code from Lava replied that there's a spell called level estimation. It shows the level and characteristics. That should be sufficient. But the protagonist couldn't use his essence power, because then the constellation would notice him immediately. So he was told that he didn't need to use his essence power for this spell. It was said that it was quite easy, and any constellation could do it. The main character then used the Eye of Sauron. After looking at the captain, he immediately revealed the essence of him. If Randy learned this ability, who could give out a lot more information? It was a skill Randy could train too. After a long journey, the dungeon was cleared. The joy on the hunters' faces was very visible, for they wanted to return home to the land sooner. The dungeon would soon close. Randy was very glad he was finally heading to Earth. At this time on the land of the Mojave Desert, Nevada, a group of hunters could not advance to the dungeon. A large storm appeared. It looked like Storm had made the constellation. But out of this storm, Randy and his friends appeared. He looked up at the sky and sighed heavily. "I'm finally home," said Randy. The dungeon mirror of demonic illusions that Hans's hunters cleaned out in the Mojave. That was his final rank. It was with the rank. The captain was very angry because he thought he deserved better. He said it wasn't fair because there were thousands of zombies. He said the rank of a dungeon is determined by the strength of the boss. They learned their numbers when checking, so he was given rank C instead of F. Since there was no knowledge of King Gule Taruna on Earth, they didn't suspect that they were able to survive in a dungeon. It turned out the captain was royalty. They called him Prince Parker of the group. And Randy was wondering why there were so many paparazzi. Looks like his friend was a star. The goblin was quite surprised that the man was royalty, but you couldn't tell by looking at him. Randy, lying on the couch, said that a real king would not be pleased with him. Even though Randy wasn't that good at English, somehow they understand what it says. At this point, Lava's kitten says that the eye of the constellation can see through lower entities, and adds that it would be strange if the constellation couldn't understand the language of mortals. At which point the doctor walks in and says the exam is absolutely done. Randy is completely healthy. The doctor said she'd never seen such a perfect body. It was as if God had given Randy such a body. The doctor was very surprised. Randy's mental health seems to have been great too. The doctor said he's going to have to go through a lot of rehab. If Randy wanted to, he could move to another country and they would help him. He smiled affectionately and said he would think about it. At that moment, a man came up to the goblin in a human body and told him not to worry if he lost his memory. He promised that the American government would help him regain his memory. Well, Goblin gave them the same answer, that he refuses and he will follow Mr. Randy. The journalist asked him what was going on in the abyss, why he was so attached to him. The guy laughed and answered how he would know, because when they met he had already lost his memory. Randy was not going to tell the whole truth, and decided to come up with such a deception. He did not want to reveal to people that he was a constellation. Reporters suspected it was because of the first person he met after losing his memory. The reporter asked Randy if he had ever considered moving to another country. They urged him to move to America. They said there was no better country for a hunter than America. But Randy was totally against it. He always said he'd think about it, but he knew he'd never leave. The four reporters started whispering behind Randy's back, curious to know more about him, because he was the first person who had been there for years. The goblin told Randy that with his magic he could easily overhear them. Randy agreed. He was curious what they were discussing. Randy heard what they were talking about. They wanted to get him to move to America. They had a plan to give him a lot of money and buy him an expensive house. They thought it would work. They wanted to send a spy to him so that other countries wouldn't lure him to another country. Goblin asked Randy if I could get rid of them, but Randy immediately calmed him down and told him not to make life so difficult. Randy wanted to get a hunter green card. To get this card, the returnee has to go through many procedures. The professor told Randy that he would now change the amount of his mana. He asked to pour his mana into the crystal ball. When Randy did it, the crystal ball exploded. The professor couldn't believe his eyes, for it was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. After the orb burst, the protagonist said he still had a lot of mana left. Randy went to the professor and said he needed to improve his rank from years ago. A bow crystal ball created to measure mana contains many times more mana than a normal hunter has. A lot of hunters couldn't handle this orb. After all, when a hunter puts Manu into it, the color of the orb changes to show his rank. Randy said he wasn't used to holding back, but he had his own reasons for using all his strength. The girl realized that he did it on purpose. She was worried that he didn't overdo it so that he wouldn't be noticed by the other constellations. After all, Earth is different from the Abyss. There are rules here. The protagonist could safely find strong opponents in the Abyss, Well, on Earth, you can't do that. Randy wanted to get an A rank because no one had ever gotten an A rank in martial arts before. If he wanted to get a hero rank, he should raise his rank at every opportunity. The protagonist wanted to see what rank he got. He was very surprised to see that he was still a C rank. He was even more surprised that the card said his age was 57. Even though Randy in the Abyss wasn't aging in the slightest, he was still 28. The captain of the hunters came up to them. He said Randy had saved his life. Now he had to pay for it. He asked them if they should stay on the land after years of absence. He wanted to take them home and told them to feel free to stay as long as they wanted. They agreed. Because they had no other choice, they got into a luxury limousine and drove home. Randy asked Richard when he was going to give away all his savings. Richard didn't expect such a question. He couldn't understand what he was talking about. Randy smiled and said he had heard him say he would give away all the jewelry if someone asked him. Well, it was all a joke. On the way home, a limo crashed into a Lamborghini. Randy immediately began to worry. Perhaps the evil constellation had found out about him being on Earth. But it was unlikely the constellation would come alone to fight him alone. When they got out of the car, they saw a man with glasses. Randy and Goblin immediately felt that he was different. He was an unusual man. It was a dragon, and Richard immediately panicked, and it was obvious he was a famous person. Well, Randy didn't realize who he was or who he was. He walked up to Randy, didn't tell him he knew him. They'd known each other a long time. Then Randy recognized him. It was his former boss who had encouraged him in his endeavors. All Richard's guards were amazed, for his boss had become a real star. They called him a dragon, for he was a hunter of rank. Then Randy heard from the guards that he was one of the strongest hunters on this earth, and he had gotten married last week, for it was his 19th marriage. He couldn't believe his boss had grown so much in hunter knowledge. Randy remembered him urging him not to go after monsters a rank above their strength. Let's go back to the year when the evil constellations invaded the world at the same time. Back then, they were called the Scourge of Soul. Every hunter fought against the monsters, and the head of the invincible Huang clan was also among them. Thanks to the efforts of such hunters, South Korea was able to resist the invasion. After this incident, they were called heroes. The government also called them heroes to the world, but they got nothing but the title. And after that incident, he moved from Korea to America. After all, hunters there were treated much better and paid more. He got good support, caught some monsters, created a company, and appeared on TV a couple times. And that's how he became a superstar. The boss said Randy hadn't changed a bit. He was still just as quiet. He remembered the letter Randy had left before he went into the Abyss. And after that, he'd been missing for years. Some people started saying Randy was dead, and we should report him dead, because no one had ever come back from the Abyss before. The boss said they even held a memorial ceremony in Randy's honor. They were very surprised when they saw his name on the list of those who had returned from the Abyss. Then the boss turned to Richard and asked him why they were riding in his car. Richard replied that he only wanted to pay him to save his life. The boss took him gently by the head and said he thought he was taking them to some estate to tear them apart or something. Well, think what a grateful reason that would be. Randy looked around at the city, and it looked like it had been years, because there were a lot of cars flying around. This city was Los Angeles. After his brother's arrival, hunters arrived, hungry for fortune and glory. The clans of these hunters, the hunters who want to be part of these clans, and those who want to do business with the hunters. This place has become a hunter town. And when the boss came to the States, he asked for immediate reports on who came back from the Abyss. If they missed any, he would move to another country. Randy looked out the window and saw that there were a lot of people in the street. He wondered why there were so many of them. The boss said they were waiting their turn to meet him. Randy didn't understand why they would do that. He said that people wanted to ask him for a chance and said he would explain it to Randy later. Randy was very surprised to see that there were pandas in his house. The boss said he got them from the Chinese government. One of his employees thought it was too much, but the boss didn't bother with him. He asked him his name and then fired him. When Randy saw it, he was shocked. He said his boss had turned into a shitty person. The boss asked why. Randy didn't understand how a man could be fired for just one mistake. But the boss disagreed with him, because he was paying him a lot of money. Then the boss called his secretary. He asked how long he had been working here and how much he had earned. The secretary replied that he had been working here for weeks and had earned $230.00. But Randy didn't agree with him. He said it wasn't about the paycheck. He treated them badly. The boss said he warned them when he hired them because they get the highest pay. If they make a mistake, he fires them right away. Randy said that to Hyung, as the former head of his clan, he should be a role model. One of the boss's assistants spoke briefly about events on Earth, what had happened in the last few years. She talked for over a minute. Then Randy learned that the evil constellations had taken over China, North Korea, Central Europe, South America, and Mexico. Because the invasion of the evil constellations in North Asia, it was May of the year. And South Korea, where Randy was born, was not occupied. In fact, it was one of the countries that handled the invasion well. But many Koreans have